Hello, I'm Måns Kallentoft. I'm the writer of Midwinter Sacrifice. In Midwinter Sacrifice, I choose the setting to be an extreme Swedish winter, it's the coldest winter ever. And in the beginning of the book, we meet a dead man hanging naked in a tree, and he looks sort of out over the landscape and looks way to the endless forest in distance and thinks what kind of evil can come out of these woods, and how did I end up here in this tree. And he also looks at the lakes and towards the town in the distance and asks himself the question, how did I end up here? What kind of evil came out of this cold and these woods and the history that they have? I give a voice to the dead man hanging from the tree in my books because I wanted to add a touch of magic and give the text a wider feel almost, because a lot of Scandinavian crime novels and crime novels in general, they're quite bleak and deeply rooted in some social realism almost. In Swedish crime novels, there is a lot of references to IKEA and doing dishes and drinking bad booze, and that is fine. But I also felt there was room for a bit of magic. Most heroes in Scandinavian crime novels or crime novels in general, I would say, are male detectives in their 50s who drinks too much, works too much, have problems with relationships, and that is fine, and it's very much a beloved character of literature, I would say. But I felt for me it would be much more interesting to take all those traits and give them to a young hero, a female hero in her early 30s. And so that's Malin Fors, I would say. She has all those traits. She works too much, she drinks too much, has problems with relationships, but she's still a young person who is not formed by the world. For me, Malin Fors has just pretty much taken on her own life now, and it's not like if I decide what's going to happen to her anymore. And so when I sit down to write about her, it's pretty much as she tells me what she needs in her life and what's going to happen to her. And if she wants to drink herself almost to death, okay, then I'm more or less her humble servant. If she looks for love, maybe she tells me to write in someone who can be her love interest. And but one thing is sure, that Malin, something always happens with her. She's always going to be ending up in some kind of trouble and in situations that can become dangerous or very, very emotional, I will say. The book Sack, and the series about Sack, is based on the myth of Hercules. I tried to take this, maybe the most powerful Greek myth of all, and transform to modern day Stockholm. So Sack is a contemporary Hercules hero, but a policeman in Stockholm. And there's going to be one book for each of Hercules' 12 deeds, and the first book, Sack, is based on the 8th deed of Hercules, where he goes to the northern part of Turkey to kill some man-eating horses, but here instead it's wolves in the woods north of Stockholm. I had known for a long time that I wanted to adopt some kind of ancient myth, just not the Hercules myth, but when I got the idea to adopt the Hercules myth and found the 12 deeds and saw how easily they would be to transport to modern day times, because there was loads of ideas popping up when I studied the myth closely. So it's been much more fun than hard. Quite easy to adopt them, actually. But my previous series, which I'm still working on, the series about Malingfors, Atomen, Ivier, the season series, it had thankfully quite a big success. So I was way too busy traveling and promoting that to even have time to think about a new story. And I also had a family during that time, so there was no time to develop this. But now I find the time and the energy to do it. So, but I knew that I wanted to do it completely differently. On the book Sack in the series, I'm collaborating with Marcus Luterman, another writer. And I choose to find a collaborator for the series because I had written 12 books on my own, which was a very, very rigid, lonely process. And now I felt to evolve as a writer, I needed to get a lot of new energy and rethink my whole creative process. And one of the things I did was to involve a co-writer. And it's been great so far. I've always been very influenced by classical storytelling, I think, all from Homer and onwards. But if we're talking about crime writing, one of my great heroes and one that led me into writing crime was Walter Mosley, the American writer behind Devil in a Blue Dress, for example, and the Easy Rawlins stories. Because when I read his books, I realized that you can do quality literature in the realms of crime fiction and do it in a very relevant way.
Scandinavians like institutions, and so they put their detective in the police office, okay? And he is a member of the police force, and sometimes this is a good police force and sometimes a little less, but you rarely find the rampant corruption in the police force that you find in American crime fiction. How many dirty cops are there in American crime fiction? We don't have time to list them all right now. It's a very, very common and beloved genre in the United States is the dirty cop or the renegade cop. You know, the police department is all corrupt, so here comes Mr. Renegade Cop to fix the situation. The Scandinavian feeling about this tends to be more that essentially the police are a good institution, and we should uphold them. We should correct their faults, but, you know, they're okay. They're working stiffs like you and me, right? The other aspect of this that's also interesting is that the Scandinavian crime novels tend to depict the criminal not as an evil demon from hell, but a human being whom society has failed. If we had been better people, and if we had built a better society, and if we didn't make the mistakes that we make, this person wouldn't have had to go out and kill 10 people, right? It's really our fault, okay? And we need to fix this problem. And so one of the things about Scandinavian crime fiction for an international audience is that from our point of view, it's an exotic setting, right? Wow, look at how these people live, you know. And it's, so the way in which the books are very often very strongly based in a place, and it's a place that's foreign to many readers, has a certain amount of allure. So when 1989 comes, there's a huge shift in relationships in Europe, right? And you have this opening of Eastern Europe, and all of a sudden people start to flood Scandinavia coming from the Baltic, right? And this changes some of the culture of Scandinavia. And so that's the new Europe is one of the ways to talk about this with the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the movement of crime from Eastern Europe into Western Europe. So you have the Russian mafia, you have prostitution, you have human trading, you have all kinds of things like this, right? So these themes have become very important for Scandinavian crime fiction, and Mankel picks up on those right away. The other thing that's really important is immigration, immigration from all around the world. So the Scandinavian countries, especially Sweden, have brought in a large number of immigrants. And if I say a large number of immigrants, it wouldn't be impressive in American terms, but about 20% of the Swedish population is now either an immigrant or has immigrant parents. So that's fairly significant if you thought about 20% of the United States population. So it made a big difference in these countries, and also in how crime was perceived and how crime was depicted. Around that time then, there's a real blast of Scandinavian crime fiction. And I would like to just say that it's because Scandinavian crime fiction is so great. But that's only part of the explanation, right? It has to do with the publishing world, right? You have a hit where you're selling a lot of books, and it's like, okay, where can we get the next one of these? That's what they're always looking for. They're looking for the next one. So the Scandinavians have great luck in marketing their detective fiction abroad. So it's the detective fiction that has caught fire, and so author after author has now entered the market, and very often whether or not we like a detective series will depend on whether or not we can relate to the detective, you know. And you're saying, well, I can't really relate to Wallander, he's like this, you know. But you have empathy or sympathy, or you have some understanding for the detective, and this allows you to be captivated by the work. If you don't like the detective, you're probably not going to read the series. You need to really feel like you can identify with this person, because you're going to be spending all your time with him or her. What interests me about this is that there are certain professions that are closely allied with detective work. One is the journalist, and you have a journalist detective in Stieg Larsson's trilogy, the Millennium Trilogy. But another, doctors and nurses, because doctors and nurses are trained to look at symptoms and to try to find out what the history of a disease is, right? So these professions are often placed, you know, if you have, for example, the coroner in so many detective fiction now, the coroner is a very important person. So they need journalists to have this sort of social networking, and they need doctors to help them with finding the genetic clues very often nowadays. I don't know if the rest of you have noticed this, if some of you are crime fiction readers, but crime fiction has become progressively more violent. I mean, no one could dream of some of the stuff that's come up with in contemporary crime fiction. And the interest in the human body that you have in a series like CSI, Crime Scene Investigation, where the main interest is on forensic evidence, what happens then to the human body is that it becomes like an object. It becomes a thing to be dissected that's made up of component parts but is not really fully a human being. And for many of us, that's not the most important part of crime fiction. For many of us, psychology is more important, right? But crime fiction has sort of drifted toward, partially because of the interest in genetics and genetic evidence, but for other reasons as well. It's become more violent and more interested in the body and less interested in the mind. My main theory about it is that I think that the Scandinavians, as a general rule, there are two things that characterize Scandinavian literature from my point of view, having read a lot of it. And one is that they're very, very interested in confrontations with darkness. So whatever is out there that scares you or is, you know, the most terrifying thing you can think of, that's the thing they're going to want to write about. Okay, that's why we have August Strindberg. That's why we have Ingmar Bergman. That's why because there's something about a confrontation with the deepest kinds of fears that one can imagine that really is part of a Scandinavian tradition. The other thing is what I was talking about a little bit is the interest in the perfectibility of the human being. How can we perfect human society? And one of the best ways to do it is to critique human society. Never let anyone get away with a mistake. Try to design things so that no one will fall through the cracks. And the crime fiction is designed to show what happens when you design something that doesn't work well.